Okay, on the RSV, we're looking at some later editions, and we've done 4 of those last time. We looked at the 1952 RSV. The reason we put that there as later edition because it revises the 1946 original New Testament. And we looked at the 10th anniversary, I believe, in 1962. Then the Catholic one, where we spent most of our time, 1966, the Catholic edition of the RSV, the Common Bible of 1973, and then finally, number 5 then, this morning, the Oxford Annotated Bible. The Oxford Annotated Bible, Oxford named after the publisher, RSV 1962. 1962. Now, we generally give things, whenever we study them, in chronological order. Notice that really this should come as like number 3, with the Roman Catholic Bible and the Common Bible of 66 and 73 coming after it. The reason we put the Oxford Annotated Bible as number 5, the last one, is because really it's a study Bible. None of the others are study Bibles. They're simply different types of RSVs, different editions of the RSV. Do you know what the word annotated means? Like an annotated bibliography? Will be a bibliography. You know what a bibliography is. At the end of a book, you'll have a list of books that you might want to study on that subject. If it's annotated, then the author's going to make comments about that. Okay? It's always good to have, if you're going to have a bibliography, have an annotated one. Because just books are listed. You don't know if they're good, right, wrong, conservative, liberal. If it's an annotated bibliography, and you don't find that very often, and I think it's because modern writers think that that would be being critical, to have to say this is liberal, or they would say that you know everything, or you think you're a know-it-all, to say this is liberal and this is conservative and so forth. You find a few of those, and it's very helpful to have. So annotated is kind of another way of saying a study Bible, that you're going to have lots of comments, not just the Bible, not just a new edition of it, but a lot of comments on the Bible. So really it's a study Bible. We should look at it later whenever we look at study Bibles, but it so necessarily fits here because it's an RSV Bible that I think we'll discuss it now, which is to discuss it ahead of time. All right, so in 1962, Oxford Publishing Company published the RSV text. They don't change the text. That's not the difference of this Bible. Along with a whole list of other things, such as separate introductions, book by book, separate introductions, scholarly essays on various biblical themes, exegetical footnotes, which really makes it into a study Bible as you would think of a study Bible, a table of weights and measures. Some Bibles will have that, even if they're not a study Bible, maps, and a chronological table, or really tables, plural, of the kings and rulers of Israel. 1962, the RSV published by Oxford Publishing Company with all of these extra benefits. Therefore, the name the Oxford Annotated Bible. Now, in 1966, shortly after the publication of the RC RSV, that was number 3 that we looked at last time, the Oxford Annotated Bible received the official imprimatur of Richard Cushing, Archbishop of Boston, which in effect then gives us 2 RC RSVs in the same year, okay, 1966. One, the third one that we discussed last time, number 3 under later editions of the RSV, simply the RSV translated with a few minor changes from the official RSV text to make it congenial to Catholic readership. The same year, 1966, shortly after the publication of that, the Oxford Annotated Bible, which, as you can see, would have been on the market for 4 years now, receives the official imprimatur of the Archbishop Richard Cushing of Boston. Now, Now, if anything receives the imprimatur of the Archbishop of Boston or New York or Chicago or something like that, then it means that basically Roman Catholic readership in the United States can read the book under consideration. And because it contained all the canon of the LXX, that's all of the apocryphal books. Now, we don't believe that the original LXX in Alexandria, Egypt had the apocryphal books. A lot of them weren't even written whenever at least the law, the Pentateuch, the Torah, was first translated around 250 to 200 BC in Alexandria, Egypt. But because the Oxford Annotated Bible, the 1962 one, contains the canon of the entire LXX, then it was also, the same year, approved by the Eastern Orthodox Church. I mean, it also, in other words, has 1st and 2nd Esdras and the Prayer of Manasseh. So what we would say here, I've said something similar last time on number 4, last week about the Common Bible of 73, but we're several years earlier, 7 years earlier to be exact, 1966. Therefore, for the first time in over 400 years, the Roman Catholics, the Protestants, the Eastern Orthodox, all read from the same Bible with official approval. So that makes the Oxford Annotated Bible of 1962 rather unique. Now see, the same will be true of the Common Bible. That was number 4 that we discussed last time, but that's 7 years later. So the Oxford Annotated Bible of 62 has that distinction first. For the first time in over 400 years, RCs, Protestants, and EOs, Eastern Orthodox, all read from the same Bible with official approval. Then, still under number 5, in 1977, it was reissued. You know, there's an original Schofield and there's the new Schofield. Everybody does something like that. So what we have is the new Oxford Annotated Bible. The new Oxford Annotated Bible. So really you've got now 2 Oxford Annotated Bibles. The one of 1962 and then B, the one of 1977. The new Oxford Annotated Bible. It includes the second major revision of the RSV New Testament done in 1971. First major revision is in 1952, whenever the whole RSV comes out. But in other words, if you're asking why do a new Oxford Annotated, you already have one, well, they're taking into consideration the new revisory work which has been done on the RSV's New Testament in 1971. And with the so-called full canon of the LXX, things like 1st and 2nd Esdras and the Prayer of Manasseh, the new Oxford Annotated Bible also throws in 3rd and 4th Maccabees, which are really considered pseudepigraphal books and not apocryphal books. 3rd and 4th Maccabees and Psalm 151. I mean, you've got everything in this Bible. Those are placed at the conclusion to the New Testament. 3rd and 4th Maccabees. Remember, there's also a 5th Maccabees. I don't know why they didn't put that in, but they do give us that 151st Psalm. I'll ask you for the second time in the history of this church. You didn't remember last time, I don't think. What's Psalm 151 about? David and Goliath. Maybe you did remember last time. You remember it this time to be sure. The opinion of F.F. Bruce, he's a noted scholar, but he's not always believable though. He calls the 1977 edition, and I quote, the best available one-volume annotated edition of the English Bible. That's just F.F. Bruce's opinion. The best available one-volume annotated edition of the English Bible. Now, he wrote that statement prior to the publication of the NIV Study Bible. He may say something differently after that. But I wouldn't be a big fan of the RSV. I don't care how good the notes would be and so forth. And the notes, I mean, if you're throwing in a Bible, 3rd and 4th Maccabees and Psalm 151, I doubt conservatives are responsible for all of that. But Bruce says, although Bruce is probably one of the best-known New Testament scholars alive today. I think he's still alive. He's got to be about 80 in England if he is. He's certainly one of the best known scholars. He's just written book after book after book after book. He has been known to espouse some liberal views, such as writing some blurbs on the back of Fudge's book on immortality, which is interesting. We'll cover that some other time. What is his name? Edward or Edmund Fudge or something? Believes in annihilationism, doesn't believe in hell. And Bruce doesn't, I don't think he comes right out and says that he agrees with what Fudge has to say about annihilationism, but he has some praiseworthy remarks, let's say, about Fudge's comments, which would be to deny the existence of hell. And it surprised me when I first saw that, because Fudge's book came out like in 1982 or something, and I was just becoming more and more acquainted with a lot of these writers, and I knew F.F. Bruce at the time, and I was a little surprised. But since then I found Bruce getting too close to some other strange notions that you wouldn't picture someone of Bruce's conservative caliber and his nature doing, but he does. So a warning to the wise, let it be sufficient. Some of you have read after F.F. Bruce. He has a lot of good things to say, no question about that. But I wouldn't agree with Fudge in his argument. Okay, so much for the RSV. And I ended last time by saying that the popularity of the RSV can be seen in its widespread use in various commentaries. So I don't think I'll go over that again. We spent 3 weeks then on number 25, the RSV. That's the most important Bible of the first half of the 20th century, as far as importance is concerned. Not reliable, but the most important one. So we come to number 26, simply entitled The Holy Bible. The Holy Bible, 1955. That should be somebody's birth year in here. We're getting close to some people. Now, it is a Roman Catholic translation. Thus far, we've only discussed one Roman Catholic translation. They're always rather slow in moving forward with vernacular translations. They're always right at the very end of the race for getting a Bible in the language of the people. That's because of a lot of their notions that are carryovers from pre-Reformation and Reformation times. But the Westminster version is the only one that we have discussed thus far, which was a Roman Catholic translation into English of this century. The first installment in Westminster, I forget what number that was we discussed, back in the teens or so, I guess. It was a good while ago. Was Thessalonians, which came out in 1913. That's how long ago it was. The New Testament was complete in 1935, and as far as I know, they are still not through with the Old Testament. Westminster is a rather strange name for a Roman Catholic Bible. The name Westminster is so indelibly connected to Reformed Protestantism, but it simply had to do with the place where it was done, a place named Westminster. I still find that unique, that the Catholics would ever adopt a name like that, because Westminster, especially with Reformed Protestantism, the Westminster Confession of Faith and shorter catechism and longer catechism, when you say the name Westminster, you're talking about Protestantism. To have a Roman Catholic Bible called Westminster version is just beside me, but it had to do with a place called Westminster, and there are many cities and places named that in the world. And of course, we just finished looking at a Catholic RSV, but really that's a Protestant translation taken over by the Roman Catholics. The only Catholic translation we've looked at thus far is the Westminster version. So now with number 26, the Holy Bible, we come to the first authorized, official, Roman Catholic, English translation of the 20th century. We come to the first authorized, official, Roman Catholic, English translation of the 20th century. I seem like I'm feeling a little better this morning, but it looks as though I look worse. So, if you don't like what you see, just look down and listen and take notes. Praise the Lord. Fire is a dreadful thing when you catch on fire and you're burning. Hallelujah. It's the work of one Monsignor Ronald A. Knox. So I never call it the Holy Bible, since all Bibles are called that. I call it Knox's translation. Ronald A. Knox. And you always see, first of all, this Roman Catholic title, Monsignor. You always see that, so I thought I would give you that as well. It's spelled M-O-N-S-I-G-N-O-R. Monsignor. And it's always abbreviated M-S-G-R period. All it is just a Roman Catholic ecclesiastical title. We could go into a little more detail of the prelates and exactly what position this would be in the Roman Catholic Church, but we don't need to take the time to do that. Just know that that's what he's always called. You hardly ever see his name alone. I don't know why, but you hardly ever see Ronald A. Knox or R.A. Knox. It's always Monsignor R.A. Knox or Ronald A. Knox or Monsignor Knox. Knox lived from 1888 to 1957. Knox's translation is an accurate one, a scholarly one, that has won widespread approval in the Roman Catholic Church as well as in Protestant churches. Let's say something about the man, Ronald Knox, in the first place. I would begin by making a comment about his name. As with Westminster, simply this man's name, Knox, has a strongly Protestant ring to it. That Knox is the founder of the Scottish Presbyterian Church. Whenever you talk about Knox, John Knox, you think of Protestantism. So it's interesting that with the first Roman Catholic Bible, they named it Westminster, and the second one is done by a man with a famous Protestant name, Knox. You've heard of John Knox in church history before. Well, he just happens to have a Protestant name. So I suppose it's appropriate that he began his life as a Protestant. He was the son of the Anglican Bishop of Manchester, England. So I guess it's okay to have a good Protestant name. That's how he began his life. He was the son of the Anglican Bishop of Manchester, England. He had a very brilliant education as a young man at the colleges of Eton, E-T-O-N, and Balliol, B-A-L-L-I-O-L, famous English universities. He had a very brilliant education at Eton and Balliol. I think Derek Prince was educated in classics at Eton. Became a minister in the Church of England in 1912. But for a series of personal reasons, he left the Church of England in 1917 and joined, you guessed it, the Antichrist Church. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant to say the Roman Catholic Church. We've seen a lot around this time in history. Newman did it in the century before, and G.K. Chesterton is doing it around this time, really a few years earlier. See a lot of people changing over, so Pope must have been good. They must have had a good Pope during those years. People are going over to the Roman Catholic Church. He becomes a priest, the Roman Catholic Church, 2 years later in 1919. And the next installment of his life, we find him as chaplain to the Roman Catholic undergraduates at Oxford from 1926 to 1939. In other words, from 1919 to 1925 or 26, he's simply a Roman Catholic parish priest. But from 1926 to 1939, he retires in 1939. He is the chaplain to the Roman Catholic undergraduates at Oxford. He resigns in 39 to devote the rest of his life, from 39 to 57, to devote the rest of his life to writing. He was a very brilliant, able scholar and writer. who shortly after this time decides to take up the full-fledged work of Bible translation. He's been described by people like, well, I guess I don't need to give the name, just someone that I was reading after writing some on Knox. I quote, an eminent scholar, churchman, preacher, literary stylist, satirist, and writer of detective stories. So he was very versatile, very versatile. And I don't say that to criticize him. I'm saying he was a very able writer. Whenever you can translate from the ancient languages and write scholarly review articles and detective stories and novels, very few people can do that. You generally have one genre of literature that is your domain, and when you can get outside of that, you're generally considered to be a very fantastic, excellent writer. Someone like William F. Buckley, Jr., the well-known columnist, he is a fantastic writer because he can write in so many, he can write children's stories, he can debate with anybody almost on any topic in the world. I mean, anything from nuclear warfare to Roman Catholic theology. He knows a whole lot because he came out of the Roman Catholic Church, a whole lot about the Roman Catholic Church. And he can sit down and write children's stories, I mean a whole story in maybe a half hour or 2 hours. And I mean that's a finished product, so he's a very versatile writer, Bill Buckley. And a few people can do that, not very many. But Knox was a very good writer. I'll say it again, an eminent scholar, churchman, preacher, literary stylist, satirist, and writer of detective stories. So, something about the man, Ronald Knox. He starts off his life as a Protestant. He converts to Roman Catholicism. He has a very capable mind. He has excellent training in two of England's well-known schools, Eton and Balliol, and so forth. Now, something about the translation. Let's get into that. The history of Ronald Knox's translation. In 1938, year before he retires, Knox has been sending out feelers to the Roman Catholic hierarchy concerning Bible translating work. I don't know exactly what got him interested in this. But in 1938, he was given permission by the Roman Catholic hierarchy in England to prepare a new translation of the New Testament. As we'll see, the New by far is more important in Knox's work and more accurate than the Old. I won't have that much to say about the Old. A new translation of the New Testament based on the Clementine, sometimes called the Sixto-Clementine edition of the Vulgate. You can cross-reference this with lit tapes 137 and 138 for an understanding of editions of the Vulgate right up into the 20th century. Lit tapes 137 and 138 to see what I mean by the Clementine edition of the Vulgate. Now, he had sent out feelers. He had been given permission in 38 to do the work. This finally becomes public knowledge. It's announced to the public in 1939. And it's right at the start of the Second World War, and it caused quite a stir among Roman Catholics. Because after all, vernacular translations have simply not played a major part in the history of Roman Catholicism. Why would you need a Roman Catholic translation? You've got the Latin, the priests know the Latin, everything is still read and done in Latin in the Roman Catholic Church of this day, so why need a translation? And Catholics aren't supposed to read the Bible. They don't need to read the Bible, there's no need to read it. And anyway, you've got part of the Westminster version available at this time. So it causes quite a stir among the Roman Catholic people. I mean, the hierarchy has given him permission. And it's really the support from the hierarchy that sees him through to the end, because there was some very vocal, violent opposition, not only from the rank and file people of the Roman Catholic Church, but from ministers, priests, and so forth in the Roman Catholic Church. But he had the right connections, right strings tied to, and permission from the right people high enough up in the English Roman Catholic Church so that no one could stop him. I mean, he didn't just do this on his own as a renegade. He was given official authority. That's why we say it's the first authorized official Roman Catholic English translation of the 20th century. And I think it's the support and the approval of the English Roman Catholic hierarchy that sees him through to the end. So he begins work right after he retires, 39 in 1940. The New Testament is published in 1944. Now, a whole lot of books say 1945, but really it was published a year earlier. We have had problems earlier in Bible and looking at the dates of Bible translations, because sometimes when it's very far back in history, it's a little fuzzy. Was it, 1518 or 1519? It doesn't make a whole lot of difference, but I'm sure that the New Testament was published in 1944, although many, many books say 1945. And it was approved immediately for use by Roman Catholic readership in England, Wales, and Scotland. Shortly after that, it also received the imprimatur. That's the nihil obstat that we talked about in one of the ethics messages on uses of the term nihil. Received the imprimatur of Archbishop Spellman of New York City. Now, these are big names in this century United States Roman Catholic history. Those of you that were Roman Catholics probably remember these names, Cushing and Spellman. Then he set about to learn Hebrew. He did not know Hebrew. He knew Greek. He had been trained in the classics. Hebrew is not exactly one of the classics. He teaches himself Hebrew and then begins translating the Old Testament, for which he does not have official approval. He does this on his own. Hierarchical permission was given only for the New Testament at this time. But I guess he just assumes if we're going to do the New Testament, we might as well do the Old as well. That speaks highly of Knox himself. It speaks highly of Knox that he would take the trouble to teach himself Hebrew sufficiently that he would be a capable translator of the Hebrew Old Testament. He does that all on his own with no official approval, and at the same time, in his mind anyway, with no certain hope that this will ever really make it off the press with the imprimatur of the Roman Catholic Church. But the Old Testament is published in 1949 in 2 volumes. It does not have official sanction at the time. He does a little bit of revision on it, and with a little revision, later it too receives official sanction. So to sum that up again, the New Testament comes out in 1944 with official Roman Catholic approval on really both sides of the Atlantic. The Old Testament comes out in 1949 in 2 volumes without official approval. With a little revision, a couple of years later, it also receives official sanction. And then finally, the whole work comes out in 1 volume in the year that you have down for number 26, 1955. So that's the date that we've given you. We could have done 44 since the Old Testament really is hardly known with Ronald Knox. And it's been often reprinted since. Knox felt that this was the greatest work of his life. Better than anything, more important than anything he had ever done before. Even more important than those detective stories he had written. I say that. I'm sure he felt it was much more important. He found out in the process how extremely difficult and exacting the work of Bible translation really was. He spent 9 months just on the book of Psalms. 9 months just trying to work his way through the book of Psalms. So maybe the difficulty of the work, the nature of it, caused him to feel this was the greatest work that he had accomplished in his life. Not only written work, but just work, period. As a teacher, as a Roman Catholic priest, as a chaplain of Roman Catholic undergraduates at Oxford, or whatever it might be, that his greatest work or greatest accomplishment in life had been the translation of the entire Bible. All right, there's some about the man Ronald Knox and the history of the translation. Let's come to some features, some bad, some good, some features of R.A. Knox's Bible. We'll start on the left foot and look at some that are not so good. In the first place, although Knox consulted, and we're going to be talking mostly about the New Testament. So if I'm not qualifying it, we're probably talking about the New Testament. Although Knox consulted the original Greek text, his translation was based squarely on the Latin Vulgate. Now, you know that's just typical of Roman Catholic thinking. The Latin Vulgate is the Bible. Jerome's Bible of the 5th century is the Bible of the Roman Catholic Church. To this day, it really is. It's never been superseded. No papal decrees have ever come to annul those that have been put forward earlier. So this is a serious deficiency with Ronald Knox's Bible. It's based squarely and firmly on the text of the Vulgate. So the original, now we'll qualify, 1949 Old Testament, his Psalms was a translation of what we call the Gallican Psalter. Okay, 1949 in his Old Testament, his book of Psalms, on which he spent 9 months, was a translation of the Gallican Psalter. Now Jerome, let's see, I have a cross-reference, Lit tape number 132. See, isn't that easy just to cross-reference and then put all the work on your shoulders? I'll say this much about it. Jerome does several different psalters. First of all, he starts off with the Roman Psalter. Jerome starts his translating work while he's back in Rome. Eusebius Hieronymus, we know him better by the name Jerome. It is, of course, a Latin translation, the end product of Jerome's. But Jerome's Latin translation in the Roman Psalter is based upon some of the Latin texts, some of the old Latin texts. Whenever he moves to Bethlehem, he becomes known as the Bethlehem monk or hermit. He spends, about 35 years, the end of his life, I believe, as a hermit in Bethlehem. He produced the second Psalter, known as the Gallican, Gallican, the Gallican Psalter. It received that name later in history because it was very popular in Gaul, the Roman province of Gaul, Gaul, up in Spain. The Gallican Psalter is a translation of the 5th column of Origen's Hexapla. Origen gave us this big masterpiece of early textual critical work entitled the Hexapla. 6 different columns, different translations, the Septuagint, Aquila's translation, his own, the transliteration of the Hebrew, and all of this. The Gallican Psalter, then, is a translation of the 5th column of Origen's Hexapla. But notice what we're talking about. We're talking about a translation of the Psalms. Psalms were originally written in Hebrew. You're giving us a Latin translation, but if your Latin translation is based on Greek, and that's what Origen's Hexapla, the 5th column, is, Origen's own Greek translation of the Old Testament, if it's based on Greek or Latin, then it loses some of its validity. It's suspect right away. Now, whenever Jerome later finishes his translation, he gives us a Latin translation from the Hebrew Psalter. But remember, Jerome doesn't know Hebrew to begin with. One of the most noteworthy things of almost all, with few exceptions, of the early church writers for, 1,000 years, but especially the important writers of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries A.D., hardly any of them know Hebrew. Augustine doesn't. Augustine never learned Hebrew his entire life. Well, one of the reasons Jerome went to Bethlehem was to learn Hebrew, to have himself taught Hebrew by one of the Jewish people, one of the rabbis in Palestine. So he learns Hebrew later in his life. He realizes immediately that his earlier translations of things like the Psalter, whether it's the Roman or the Gallican one, are simply not reliable because they're based on a Greek text. And it's a sad coincidence in history that the Greek-based Psalter of Jerome's is what ended up in the Vulgate and not the Hebrew one. Anyway, in 1949, Knox's Old Testament comes out with the English translation of the Gallican Psalter. Not reliable because it's based on a Greek text and not Hebrew. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew and not Greek. So you've got a translation of a translation now. Or really more than that. A translation of a translation of a translation, which just makes it not that reliable. However, in his 1949 Old Testament, a recently done Roman Catholic translation of the Psalter from the Hebrew, which we haven't discussed yet, we will discuss that later, appears in an appendix. Now that's probably getting a little confusing for you. A recently done, that is right around the same time that Knox is doing his work, another important Roman Catholic translation is being done that we simply haven't gotten to yet. It's not completed yet at this time. But another recently done Roman Catholic translation of the Psalter, that is the Book of Psalms, from the Hebrew. So they haven't gone back to Latin or they haven't gone back to Greek, but from the Hebrew is included in an appendix of Knox's 1949 Old Testament. Then whenever the entire Bible of Knox comes out in 1955, the Gallican Psalter, that is the English translation from that, is dropped and the appendix is moved into the text, which was a very good move. Did you follow all of that? No. Well, put enough heads together and you can get it afterwards. Let me just say it briefly like this for those of you that didn't get it. How can you say that briefly? That's why I said all of that. If I knew a quicker way to say it, I would say it. Knox translates the Psalter from Latin that has a Greek underlying text into English. What he needs to do is, if he's going to translate from Latin at all, translate from Latin that has a Hebrew underlying text. Okay? So what he does is, we could just say it like this, although we're leaving out a step, is he translates from Greek. He translates the Book of Psalms from Greek. He includes in an appendix a recent translation of the Book of Psalms from Hebrew. It's going to be more reliable if it's done from the original language Hebrew. That's what you find in his 1949 Old Testament. Whenever the whole Bible comes out in 1955, then the things are in essence swapped. The Greek is dropped, the appendix is brought from the appendix into the text itself. So you have an entirely new translation, not the work of Knox, by the way. That means in Knox's translation, the Book of Psalms is not done by Knox, it's done by another group of men. And you've got an entirely different reading, because it's based on an entirely different text. Now obviously a lot of things are going to be the same, but you're going to have many differences, and some of those differences will have to be significant. If they weren't, then we could just translate into 10,000 languages before we come into English, and we would still be faithful to the Greek and the Hebrew. But that simply is not possible. The more languages you translate it into, the further you get away from the original, the less reliable that final receptor language will actually be. So even if you didn't get all of that, the big thing about Knox's translation, the greatest fault, I mean, maybe I need to say it more plainly, is obvious he does not go back to the original languages. The greatest fault with Knox's translation is he goes back to the Latin Vulgate. That's what I'm saying into this first point. I just gave you one example of how it can be compounded in complications and difficulties But not only are you going back to the Latin, but through the Latin to the Greek for an Old Testament book, then you're really in trouble. So I said that he's translating from the Vulgate. Which Vulgate? The Clementine edition, or sometimes called the Sixto Clementine edition of 1592. There are many different editions of the Vulgate. Now the Sixto Clementine edition of 1592 has been the standard Vulgate text right up into modern times. If you recall, the reason that Jerome did the Vulgate in the first place was because of the confusion of existing Latin texts. I mean, there were so many Latin texts with so many different variants coming from so many different families, a North African family, an Italian family. The one reason he did the Vulgate was to try to sift through. I mean, it was an early work of textual criticism, to sift through all of these Latin translations available and find out what was the original. What's the parent language among all these siblings here? And he reduced that to what he thought was correct. Well, then Jerome's Vulgate is copied by hand over the next 1,000 years, over and over and over. And what do you have? A confusion of text of the Vulgate. Now you no longer have what Jerome translated, the Latin Vulgate. You've got various siblings from an original parent, Jerome's Latin Vulgate, spread all over the European world. And so in the period just prior to and during the Reformation, you have scholars trying to work on the existing texts of the Latin Vulgate in an attempt to bring them into harmony and to restore them to what they felt Jerome said back at the end of the beginning of the 5th century A.D. And so what they end up with is the Sixto Clementine edition of the Vulgate, after the name of a couple of popes, in 1592. And this has become the standard one right up until modern times, but it's not perfect. The Wordsworth White edition of the Vulgate, which has been done since then, that's up into the 1700s, is much more reliable. Again, you go back to those tapes I listed earlier, and you can see, or your notes, and you see what we said about the various editions of the Vulgate. And there was some deliberate hypocrisy and some deliberate misrepresentation and some deliberate lies in the Sixto Clementine that work, as you'll see in 1592 from your earlier notes. It was in one sense okay for its time, but I'm saying this: why would Knox use the Sixto Clementine edition, which was quote-unquote okay for its time, when we've had something better done between 1592 and now, namely the Wordsworth-White, after two men's names, the Wordsworth-White edition of the Vulgate. And there are other editions since then that are much better than the Sixto Clementine. So what would be interesting here is to ask ourselves this question: if he's going to follow the Vulgate, Knox, if he's going to follow the Sixto Clementine edition of the Vulgate, what is he going to do if the Sixto Clementine text of the Vulgate has a known, obvious, spurious reading? Is he going to follow it, or is he going to not so woodenly follow it and take something like what the Wordsworth White edition would have to say, something that's much more accurate? Well, here's another fault with Knox's translation. Not only does he follow the Vulgate, he woodenly follows the Sixto Clementine edition of the Vulgate, even when it has a known, proven, spurious reading. His argument: I'm a translator, not a textual critic. It's not my task as a translator to correct the variants. It's simply to take the text and just do it, whatever the text has, which is idiotic when you know that it's wrong. He just takes Sixto Clementine and simply translates straight from that, which is Latin, straight from that into English, even when there's a known, proven, spurious reading. Because he argues, I'm a translator, not a textual critic. It's not the task of the translator to correct the variants, or to have to even bother his mind with choosing among various variants. Thus, I'll give you one example. In Acts 17, 6b, he does not follow the majority of Vulgate texts which agree with the Greek in giving us the term world. Paul in Thessalonica and the people there say, these men which have turned the world upside down have come nigh to us, have come hither. The majority of the Vulgate text, in agreement with the Greek, give world. The Clementine, however, has city. City. Now the city would mean Thessalonica. Those that have turned this city upside down are bothering us. Well, that's kind of a restricting, rather terribly so, of what should be said. What has been said is those that have turned the world upside down have come here. The Sixto Clementine says those that have turned the city, meaning Thessalonica, the city upside down, are causing us problems. So Knox is not going to follow the majority of the Vulgate text or the Greek, which he knows to be right in having world, but he feels because he just has so many odds against him, he feels that it's not exactly right to take the term city and follow that. So what he does, he says he desires to compromise here, and he puts in the word state, S-T-A-T-E. He puts in the word state as kind of a compromise between world and city. So you're taking the best of both options, what he thinks. And then he has a footnote on this. And listen to what he says here in the footnote. Let me read what he has as a translation. Here they are, the men who are turning the state. Now that could be like the Greek state there. Who are turning the state upside down, they have come here too. Footnote number 3. Turning the state upside down. Rather, according to the Greek, the world. He tells us that this is what it should be, the world. But through the early corruption of one letter in certain Latin manuscripts, the Vulgate text, he means by that the Sixto Clementine, not the majority of Vulgate text, through the early corruption of one letter in certain Latin manuscripts, the Vulgate text reads the city. So he acknowledges, A, that the Greek reading is world, and B, that city is a corruption. Why not just give us world then? He gives us state as that compromise. I don't know why he would want to do something like that. Just give us world. Greek has that. Most of the Latin has that. His Sixto Clementine edition has city, and he feels that's too narrow to go with city. So he broadens it from Thessalonica to the Greek state, rather than as the Greek has to the whole world. The same is true, listen to this, if you turn over to 1 John 5:7, our heavenly witness passage. We've talked about that enough. I mean, that's one of the things that's just so well known. I mean, things like Mark 16 are still being debated in John 8, but nobody debates, that I know of, 1 John 5:7. What do we have? See, in the KJV we have it because of the deal with Erasmus, and the KJV people simply weren't aware of all of that. But by the 20th century, we're aware that this is a late corruption. Thus, we have a threefold warrant in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, three who are yet one. It's a great little verse to teach the doctrine of the Trinity, you see. To teach that God is three, and yet there's unity in the triunity, three who are yet one. It's a great verse for that. It'd be a good proof text for Trinitarian theology, but it's just not there. We've got others. We don't need that one. Here's his note. Note number 3. This verse does not occur in any good Greek manuscript. Why'd you put it there? Well, he tells us, but the Latin manuscripts may have preserved the true text. Latin, which comes several centuries later than the early Greek text, that is ignorant. Oh my. So he comes right out and admits there's no warrant for this in the Greek manuscripts, but the Latin, which come many centuries after the Greek, may have preserved the original. You know, whenever you got a bias, you're a Roman Catholic, you know that Jerome's Latin Vulgate's inspired. Whenever you got a bias, you just can't see the truth there. So there are a few faults. I don't know what number you're on. We're looking at a few faults. It doesn't matter. We've all been talking in that general area about the Vulgate. Not only does he follow the Vulgate, but he follows, I'm saying, a text that's not the best. Some of his notes and some of his translations are obviously given in favor of Arceism. I'll give you a few examples of this. Some of his notes and some of his translations are obviously given in favor of Roman Catholic dogma. Now this will be easier for you to see, to be sure, but nothing is as seriously wrong with R.A. Knox's translation as the basis on the Latin Vulgate. You cannot base the Bible on the Latin Vulgate and expect it to be up to par. But this you'll be able to easily see. For instance, if you turn over to Matthew 1, the last verse, 25. Now you'll probably recall we've used Matthew 1 a lot. People are really trying to tamper with various things over in Matthew 1, especially about the birth of Christ. Earlier, it's been the virgin birth of Christ with people like Moffat. Well, no problem with Roman Catholics about virgin birth. They just want to keep her a virgin forever. You know, some people don't like virginity and some people like it too much. So we need something in between. You know, the liberals don't want virginity. They don't want virgin birth. But then the Catholics want Mary to stay a virgin forever. So here's what we have in Matthew 1:25 is his translation. Now let me get to 24. Joseph awoke from sleep and did as the angel of the Lord had bidden him, taking his wife to himself, and he had not known her. And he had not known her when she bore a son. Well, that speaks of virgin birth then. He had not known her when she bore a son, her firstborn, to whom he gave the name Jesus. But in the KJV, I think you have a little word there, till. He did not know her till she had borne her son. Now, till could obviously imply that he knew her after that. He didn't know her until she had conceived, virgin birth, born the son, the child, the babe Jesus. He knew her after that. He didn't know her until then. Knox doesn't translate with that word till. He just says he had not known her when she bore a son, her firstborn, to whom he gave the name Jesus. And then he has a note. Not only was the translation a little suspect, but here's the note. Number 3, they just all happen to be number 3s for notes. The text here is more literally rendered, he knew her not until or till she bore a son. He admits that's what the original reading should be. The text here is more literally rendered, he knew her not till she bore a son. Then he goes on. But the Hebrew word represented by till, and I don't know why he says Hebrew, it'd be Greek. But the Hebrew word represented by till does not imply that the event which might have been expected did take place afterwards. Just what I said that it seems to imply. He did not know her till, with the implication being afterwards he did know her. He says the Hebrew word represented by till does not imply that the event which might have been expected did take place afterwards. And then he gives some verses in the Old Testament and the Apocrypha to support that. So that this phrase does not impugn the perpetual virginity of Our Lady. See, that's what he's after, the perpetual virginity of Mary. So that this phrase, or this verse here, Matthew 1:25, does not impugn the perpetual virginity of Our Lady. Nor is any such inference to be drawn when our Lord is called her firstborn. Because what would firstborn imply? A second and a third, at least a second, perhaps a third, a fourth, and so forth. So neither does that imply that, which refers to his position as redeemable under the old law, Luke 2:23. Well, I don't think he has to be concerned about the term firstborn. I think that's not even in the better Greek manuscripts there. I'm not for sure. I don't have my KJV with me here, but I don't even believe I've got firstborn in mine. So he wouldn't even have to be arguing over that. But anyway, you don't need Matthew 1:25 alone. You've got so much more. The obvious, simple, plain reading of the four gospel accounts is that Mary was a virgin when she conceived and bore Jesus Christ. She was not a virgin after that. She was known in the marital relation by her husband Joseph, and she conceived and produced at least 4 brothers and 2 sisters. That's the obvious reading. Anything else proves to me anyway that someone has a bias, and now you're trying to force the text to arrange itself to what you want it to say. Matthew 1:25 is good enough, leaving it the way we have it, though. He did not know her till she bore a son, implying that he knew her after that. Of course, he is firstborn, and even if we don't have firstborn here, firstborn in other places does imply the births of siblings afterwards. So there's one marginal or footnote reference that's rather interesting. I'm going to have to conclude with this. We'll finish Knox next time. The concept of justification is toned down wherever possible. For instance, Romans 3:26, the concept of justification is toned down wherever possible. Romans 3:26 in the KJV talks about both the just and justifier, that he might be just, and the justifier of him that believeth in Jesus. That's what the KJV has, that he might be both just and the justifier of him that believeth in Jesus. What we had, you might not catch things like this as you read through Knox, but it's important. He overlooked our former sins in the days of his forbearance, and he has also vindicated the holiness of Jesus Christ here and now, as one who is himself holy and imparts holiness to those who take their stand upon faith in him. Now, you probably wouldn't have noticed that as you read along. As one who is himself holy and imparts holiness. But he simply does not do that. The New Testament never says that he imparts holiness to us. It does say that he has justified us by faith in Jesus' blood. Justification and holiness are two terms that are not really even related. Then in Romans 4, verses 17 through 22, several places in Romans, when he has the opportunity, he attempts to tone down the concept of justification. Romans 4, 17 through 22. This is that long section about Abraham being justified by faith, his faith in God, Genesis 15:6, because of the belief that he had concerning the promise God had given him about the miracle child, Isaac. Verse 19, there was no wavering in his faith. He gave no thought to the want of life in his own body, though he was nearly 100 years old at the time, nor to the deadness of Sarah's womb. He showed no hesitation or doubt at God's promise, but drew strength from his faith, confessing God's power, fully convinced that God was able to perform what he had promised. This then, now watch 22, don't we have something about it was counted to him for righteousness? Imputed to him for righteousness. This then was reckoned virtue in him. Reckoned virtue? Virtue is a broad, generic, general, watered-down term. It was reckoned virtue in him instead of imputed righteousness. So imputation, justification are toned down whenever possible, obviously to leave room for salvation by works. It can be imputed virtue, but even a bad man can have some good in him. But in order to be a child of God, you've got to do good works for Roman Catholic theology. There are occasions where he can't do anything about it, such as in Romans 5:1. Once justified, he even uses the term, he has to. Not much else you could say about Romans 5:1. Once justified, then on the ground of our faith, let us enjoy peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, I'm going to stop with Knox. I didn't think we would get through since I had to do a little bit of RSV. What we'll look at next time, well, I have one other negative comment to make about Knox. Not a serious problem, theological problem, just some poor English in 2 Corinthians 10, 14 to 18. Then we'll spend the rest of our time with Knox looking at some good points. There are several good things that can be said about Knox in his translation. And then, of course, we'll end with a complete evaluation of Ronald Knox and his translation, and we'll have plenty of time to go into other works like Authentic, Penguin, Lamsa, and maybe we'll get to Phillips, maybe not.